There are many misconceptions about Post-Stalin USSR. We will analyze and debunk them all. In this series, we will discuss many topics, such as state of the whole people, peaceful coexistence, the post-Stalin USSR economy, the fall of the USSR, and many more topics. So if you are interested in post-Stalin USSR, be it as a leftist or just a curious person in general, just lay back and enjoy my video. Debunking Misconceptions about Post-Stalin USSR, Episode 7, the Sino-Soviet and Soviet-Albanian split, and things I forgot to mention. Before I start this video, I want to say that this episode is technically divided into 4 parts. The first is about the Sino-Soviet split, the second about the Soviet-Albanian split, the third will be about the rocky relations between Post-Stalin USSR and the DPRK, and the fourth about everything that I forgot to mention, such as the bureaucracy throughout the series. We will cover why the splits happened, who was at fault in the splits, and the timeline of the splits. Let's start with the Sino-Soviet split. So why did the split happen? There are a lot of reasons behind the Sino-Soviet split. Before we cover the biggest reason behind the split by far, let's cover the other reasons behind the split. According to an article, the following are these other reasons behind the Sino-Soviet split: the demand to transfer Mongolia to the PRC, the demand for an atomic bomb, and the demand for lost territories from the USSR. Let's go through these things one by one. Let's cover the first two things at the same time. Mao wanted all the land back that the Tsars took from China, including Mongolia. This is partially why the 1969 border clashes happened between China and the USSR. Let's watch a short documentary about this.
Next comes trouble on the Sino-Soviet border, a disputed frontier that stretches for more than 4,000 miles between the Dragon and the Bear. This line shows the extent of China's territory before the various conquests of the Tsars. China remembers this land as hers. Russia does not. It is perhaps the greatest amount of territory ever lost by one nation to another. And to heighten the problem, China, with half the area of Russia, has 3 times its population. In search of a solution, Premier Kosygin comes to Peking, but he apparently is no more successful than Nikita Khrushchev in healing the breach between the Dragon and the Bear. Confrontations on the border now become more numerous and explosive. In these timely and exclusive motion pictures from behind the bamboo curtain, the Screen News Digest provides a graphic glimpse of an angry incident involving a Russian patrol boat and several Chinese fishermen on the Ussuri River. The films, with their Chinese titles, record the intensity of the disputes on the border. A million and a half Soviet troops are reported on the Sino frontier, and tensions and incidents have repeatedly erupted into bloodshed. Here, Chinese demonstrators confront, shout at, and advance on Russian troops on the Amur River. Once again, according to the Chinese commentary, the Soviets are trying to drive the Chinese fishermen from a river island. When an armored personnel carrier attacks the fishermen, they strike back at the vehicle with wooden sticks. In the confusion, the commentary says, 4 fishermen are run over and crushed to death in the snow. The Russians are again denounced by Mao Zedong and Lin Piao, his heir apparent. The Soviet troops, they say, are revisionist fascist bandits.
This was a shitfest. Seriously, I'm very sorry, but there is no other way I can express this. It was a shitfest. Well, anyway, splitting the global socialist movement over the land, over land is part of the reason why the split happened. Mao should have just let things be the way they are. Mongolia was now independent and former Chinese land was now Soviet land. No ifs and no buts. Sorry, Mao, but that's how things are now. And another reason behind the split were nukes. Basically, Mao wanted nukes, and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev didn't give any. To quote a book. Though Mao famously declared that the atomic bomb is a paper target in August 1946, the Chinese Communist Party in fact had an early interest in acquiring nuclear weapons. Prior to Stalin's death in March 1953, Moscow was willing to offer a nuclear umbrella to all socialist countries, but was unwilling to share nuclear secrets to enable them to build nuclear weapons of their own. After Stalin's death, in an effort to win the struggle for leadership of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev resolved to improve relations with China and Mao. During Khrushchev's visit to China in October 1954, Mao told Khrushchev that he was interested in nuclear energy and nuclear weapons and hoped that the Soviet Union would assist China with its nuclear program. Khrushchev was taken by surprise. After a pause, Khrushchev attempted to persuade Mao to concentrate on economic development, arguing that it was not necessary for China to expend badly needed capital for domestic growth on a nuclear program because the Soviet Union already provided nuclear protection for China. Eager to strengthen his ties with Mao, however, Khrushchev did offer to assist the Chinese in building a very small nuclear research reactor for training technical personnel and conducting research in nuclear physics, but he offered no help in the field of nuclear weapons. Essentially, the USSR under Stalin was ready to make pacts like the Warsaw Pact with other socialist countries, but didn't want any socialist country other than the Soviet Union to own nukes. Interestingly, Nikita Khrushchev wanted to improve relations with Mao, meaning that they were already bad under Stalin. More on that later. He wanted to do anything to improve relations, even if it means letting China research nuclear physics. But just like Stalin, he did not want Mao to get nuclear weapons. He kept Stalin's line on everything. Anyway, let's continue reading. According to Arhipov's recollection, China's displeasure with Soviet policies on the nuclear test ban treaty negotiations and the prevention of nuclear proliferation also contributed to the animosity which had crept into the relationship. In 1958, when the Soviet Union asked China to support its proposal for a ban on nuclear weapons production and testing, China did not reply. In 1959, the Soviet Union inquired about the Chinese attitude regarding nuclear proliferation. The Chinese replied, stating curtly that we expect the Soviet Union to carry out the agreements regarding nuclear energy industry and to provide equipment for the production of the final products. 1 year later, however, the PRC's bombardment of Jinmen Island of Taiwan in the summer of 1958 caught Moscow off guard. The shelling, which took place without consultation with Moscow, led Khrushchev to fear that Mao was too belligerent to handle nuclear weapons responsibly. Khrushchev was justified in feeling that there was a general weakening in Sino-Soviet relations, and in retaliation decided to rescind the October 1957 Sino-Soviet agreement to deliver an instructional model of the nuclear bomb to China. By August 1960, less than 3 years later, all Soviet specialists working on China's nuclear weapons program had been recalled. However, new tensions soon emerged in the Taiwan Strait, and China and the United States were brought to the verge of another direct military confrontation after the Korean War. In July 1954, the CCP Central Committee decided that China must liberate Taiwan, but it did not call for immediate action. The United States supported the Chinese nationals and threatened the PRC with nuclear attack. Khrushchev decided to stop assisting China in developing nuclear weapons for fear that China's leadership will drag the Soviet Union into a conflict with the United States and the entire West. It should be pointed out that initially the Soviet suspension of the offer of the sample bomb to the Chinese was only meant as a warning. The Soviet Union did not intend to cut off nuclear or conventional military aid to China completely. To warn Mao, Khrushchev stopped helping China develop nukes as he became scared that Mao would use nukes incompetently incompetently and could cause nuclear warfare. More on that later, and because he didn't want nuclear war. This was part of the Taiwan crisis of 1958. We will also talk about that more later. Khrushchev didn't want to come into conflict with the US and didn't want nuclear war, which is also why he retreated from Taiwan. Mao also was angry over the fact that Khrushchev wanted to destroy all nukes that existed in the world. To the Soviets, it was a threat to humanity, whereas Mao opposed this idea as he wanted to own nukes himself. Also, Stalin wanted to get rid of nukes as well, to quote Stalin. The Soviet Union stands for prohibiting the atomic weapon and terminating the production of the atomic weapon, Joseph Stalin. So how was Mao incompetent in owning nukes? Well, let's start with the fact that Mao wanted literal nuclear warfare. To quote an article, during 1962, international events caused the final split between the Soviet Union and China. Mao criticized Khrushchev for backing down in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Khrushchev responded by declaring that Mao's policies would lead to nuclear war. Is this true? Yes, because Mao wanted to drop atomic bombs on American forces. To quote an article, Gromyko says that Mao wanted Soviet A bomb used on GIS. GI are initials used to describe the soldiers of the United States Army and airmen of the United States Air Force, and also for general items of their equipment. Mao didn't fear nuclear war. To quote Mao, today the danger of a world war and the threats to China come mainly from the warmongers in the United States. They have occupied our Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits and are contemplating an atomic war. We have two principles. First, we don't want war. Second, we will strike back anyone resolutely if anyone invades us. This is what we teach the members of the Communist Party and the whole nation. The Chinese people are not to be cowed by US atomic blackmail. Our country has a population of 600 million and an area of 9,600,000 square kilometers. The United States cannot annihilate the Chinese nation with its small stack of atom bombs. Even if the US atom bombs were so powerful that when dropped on China, they would make a hole right through the earth or even blow it up, that would hardly mean anything to the universe as a whole, though it might be a major event for the solar system. I think that we can all agree that somebody like Mao should not own nukes under any circumstances. The fact that Khrushchev stopped helping China build its own nuclear program to literally not cause nuclear war, and the fact that there was the Soviet nuclear umbrella that greatly angered Mao. Mao wanted more independence from the USSR and own nukes himself. This greatly contributed to the Sino-Soviet split. To quote the book again. Mao was very unsatisfied with the fact that Khrushchev didn't want him to have nukes and with the fact that he stopped Soviet assistance in helping China get nukes. To quote the book again, nonetheless, Khrushchev's decision to renege on the Sino-Soviet nuclear agreement indeed angered the Chinese leadership and led to China's determination to develop nuclear weapons on its own. Later, China codenamed the project to develop its first nuclear bomb 596 as a reminder of the shameful date in June 1959 when the Soviet Union withdrew support for China's nuclear program. During the Lushan conference in July 1959, Zhu Enlai told Son Renkwang and Liu Ji of the CCP's decision to use our own hands and start from the very beginning. We plan to spend 8 years in developing the atomic bomb. Zhu also proposed the policy of acting independently and the initiative in our own hands, relying on our own efforts and keeping our own foothold at home. Mao was not interested in the Soviet nuclear umbrella but wanted to have his own nuclear weapons. Eventually, Soviet specialists withdrew from China. To quote the book again. In June 1960, all Soviet experts at the Institute of Atomic Energy were recalled. The Soviets ceased providing research equipment entirely. On 6 July 1960, 8 Soviet specialists at the Beijing Institute of Nuclear engineering design received orders to return to the Soviet Union ahead of schedule. On the 8th of July, five specialists in charge of the installation of equipment at the Lanzhou enriched or uranium plant left China. By 23rd August, all Soviet specialists working for the Chinese nuclear industry had returned to the Soviet Union, taking important blueprints and materials with them. Now, only because Khrushchev withdrew Soviet specialists from China doesn't mean that he completely stopped trading with China. In fact, many people believe that he didn't give aid to Mao during the Great Chinese Famine. And this is actually wrong. Mao himself came to Khrushchev for help during the Great Chinese Famine.
Mao needs financial and technical assistance, and so he goes to Moscow. At first, all is harmony between the dragon and the bear. Mao receives the red carpet treatment, and his country holds a favored place in the community of Russian satellites.
And Khrushchev gave him aid. Now let's talk about another gigantic reason behind the Sino-Soviet split, which in many ways escalated it by a mile: the Second Taiwan Strait crisis. We already talked about this a bit already. According to Mao, Khrushchev didn't do enough to help China get back Taiwan, to quote an article. Beijing was dissatisfied with several aspects of the Sino-Soviet security relationship. The insufficient degree of support Moscow showed for China's recovery of Taiwan, a Soviet proposal in 1958 for a joint naval agreement that would have put China in a subordinate position, Soviet neutrality during the 1959 tension on the Sino-Indian border, and Soviet reluctance to honor its agreement to provide nuclear weapons technology to China. Khrushchev's role in the Second Taiwan Strait crisis was justified, as noted before in the video. If he didn't back down, then this would have caused nuclear war. Soviet neutrality in the Sino-Indian border conflict in 1959 also contributed to the split, though I'd say it was justified, as those were both anti-imperialist countries, and the USSR needed both India and China as allies, and I guess the joint naval agreement also contributed to the split, but I won't say that it would have put China into a subordinate position. Like I said before, Mao didn't want to be dictated by the USSR anymore. He wanted more independence, to quote the article again. In retrospect, the major ideological, military, and economic reasons behind the Sino-Soviet split were essentially the same. For the Chinese leadership, the strong desire to achieve self-reliance and independence of action outweighed the benefits Beijing received as Moscow's junior partner. Mao didn't want to be treated like a younger brother anymore. He wanted to be treated like an independent spokesman of the global socialist movement, and he wanted to become the only and sole leader of the global socialist movement now, to quote a book. However, in reality, the situation was not as rosy as it might seem at first glance, and one of the main reasons that could serve to further worsen relations between the PRC and the USSR is the excessive imposition of the Soviet model of socialist development on China. This could not fully suit Mao Zedong, an independent, strong politician and leader. In addition, turning to the theses of fraternal relations between the USSR and the PRC, it is necessary to pay attention to the next part. From the point of view of the Russian language, the expression fraternal relations implies mutual respect, equal rights, and equal opportunities of the two parties in relation to each other. This expression takes on a completely different meaning from the Chinese point of view. In Chinese, there are two characters. Don't know how to pronounce this. I think the older brother and the younger brother. Accordingly, the fraternal relations means relations between an older and younger brother, and this does not have the meaning of equality, which is present in the Russian language. Most likely, Mao Zedong did not want to feel like someone's younger brother, but while Stalin was alive, he had to put up with this role. This is also indicated by the fact that it was also Mao Zedong who made an official visit to Moscow and not Stalin to Beijing. Sino-Soviet relations were always pretty rocky, even under Stalin. More on that later, as I said before. Mao didn't want Soviet-style socialism, he wanted to go his own way. That's also why the Cultural Revolution, and especially the Great Leap Forward, happened. Mao wanted to be more independent and prove that China is better than the USSR, and Mao failed miserably. Mao didn't want to be controlled by the USSR, he didn't want to be the younger brother of the USSR, he wanted to be an independent spokesman for world communism, but he couldn't become a leader of the global socialist movement, he couldn't become a spokesman for world communism, let alone become the only sole leader of the global socialist movement under Stalin. Stone was the leader of the global show. Stone was the leader of the global socialist movement for 3 decades. By the point the PRC was established, nobody would have recognized Mao as the leader of the global socialist movement, and Stone wouldn't have allowed him to become co-leader either. This is actually the biggest reason behind the split between the Soviet Union and China. Mao wanted to become the sole and only leader of the global socialist movement, to quote the book again. As the main example of the opponent of the PRC in disputes over borders and territories, the Soviet Union was chosen, with which China first established fraternal relations and then declared a rivalry for the right to be called the mainstay of the ideas of Marxism-Leninism in the world, which almost turned into a full-fledged war. Like I said, Mao wanted to become the sole and only leader of the global socialist movement. We can also go more into detail this time. A fact worth mentioning is that Khrushchev offered Mao to become a leader of the global socialist movement, not the only leader, but a leader of the global socialist movement, and he offered Mao to have as much as representation as a leader of the global socialist movement as the USSR, and offered China to become the sole and only leader of the East Asian socialist movement. This is actually very fair and further justifies Khrushchev's role in the Sino-Soviet split. But this was not enough for Mao. He, with his large ego, wanted to become the sole and only leader of the global socialist movement, but that failed. More on that later. Also, and another fact worth mentioning is that Khrushchev in many ways conceded to China, such as by giving China more control over its ports, resources, and land, to quote an article. Therefore, China, led by the charismatic Mao Zedong, will claim leadership in the world communist movement against the background of the loss of the USSR's position, which will cause tension between the two largest communist countries. September 29th from September 29th to October 12, 1954, the first visit of the Soviet Party and government delegation to China, invited to the 5th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, took place. As a result of the visit, a large package of agreements were signed, which turned out to be hasty and unprofitable for the USSR. In particular, the Soviet interests in joint ventures in Xinjiang and Dalian for the extraction of non-ferrous and rare metals, oil extraction and refining, construction and repair of ships, and the organization and operation of civil air traffic were donated to China. An agreement was also signed on the withdrawal of Soviet military units from the jointly used Chinese naval base in the city of Port Arthur and on the transfer of this base to the full disposal of the People's Republic of China until May 31st, 1955. At the informal talks between Enes Khrushchev and Mao Zedong, they agreed on the equal status of both countries in the international labor and communist movement and the division of labor, according to which China was assigned responsibility for the Asian region. Like I said, Mao wanted to become the sole and only leader of the global socialist movement. We can also go more into detail this time. To quote the book again. After the death of Ivan Stalin and the coming to power of Enes Khrushchev in the USSR, Mao Zedong quickly realized that he was now the leader of one of the largest countries in the world, ready to take the baton from the Soviet Union to the position of the leading socialist state in the world. In this regard, a gradual worsening of relations between the USSR and the PRC began. The activities of Enes Khrushchev as the first secretary of the Central Committee of the CPSU also played an important role in this distancing from each other. In particular, this was facilitated by the report of Enes Khrushchev's on the code of personality and its consequences at a meeting of the 20th Congress of the CPSU on February 25, 1956. Such a blow by Khrushchev to Stalin and the code of his personality could also affect the Chinese leader in China. In turn, the code of personality of Mao Zedong was born. In addition, Khrushchev criticized the policy of the Chinese Communist Party, saying that there is no scientific Leninism present in the CPC, but only slogans. China could not leave this without attention, and in 1960, the Central Press in Beijing published an article, Long Live Leninism, which expressed complaints about the foreign policy of the USSR as well as criticism of the actions of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In response, the USSR withdrew all Soviet advisors and specialists from China, which by 1960 numbered about 1,600 people. In the conditions of gradually deteriorating relations between China and the USSR, officially Beijing decided to return to the issue of the border between the two states. After Stalin died, Mao finally believed that he had a chance to become the sole and only leader of the global socialist movement. Mao was struggling to become the sole and only leader of the global socialist movement, whereas Khrushchev was desperately trying to make the USSR keep its position as a leader of the global socialist movement, while at the same time trying to convince Mao that the USSR and China, being both the leaders of the global socialist movement, is the best solution there is to Mao's problem. Mao, with his terrible arrogance, did not listen, and thus the Sino-Soviet split happened, and the struggle between Mao and Khrushchev in trying to be the true leader of the global socialist movement began. This was also said by the documentary that we watched before.
What the
Mao
future
was
holds
also
for
scared to
Russia
lose
and China,
popularity
no one
because
knows.
of the secret speech,
But
which
millions
is
of people
ironic,
everywhere are waiting to
considering
see
that
and to
Khrushchev
learn
and Brezhnev
who in
still
the communist
supported
world is
Stalin and
truly
defended
number
him.
one.
You can watch
The dragon
episode 3,
or the bear.
part 1, 2, and the upcoming third part of episode 3 to find out more about that. And Stalin continued to be very popular in the USSR. Furthermore, what I believe is insane to find out is that it was Khrushchev who first called Mao a revisionist and not the other way around. Mao wasn't the first to call the USSR revisionist, but it was Khrushchev who called China revisionist first. Or, as the article says, according to Khrushchev, the CPC had no scientific Leninism. In response to that, Mao criticized Soviet foreign policy, including in Taiwan, and ended up denouncing Khrushchev as a revisionist as well. All this tension also is part of the reason as to why the USSR withdrew specialists from China in 1960, and this is also what led up to Mao eventually wanting more land back from the USSR. What I think is important to mention, yes, it's the moment you have all been waiting for. Sino-Soviet relations already deteriorated under Stalin, and he even went as far as calling Mao revisionist, just like Khrushchev, to quote the book again. But it was not only Mao who saw the difficulties in relations with the Soviet Union. Stalin also did not trust Mao Zedong. Just before meeting the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, he compared him to a radish, red on the outside, white on the inside. And although the formal meeting of the two leaders in Moscow ended productively the signing of the treaty, but their personal meetings were short and dry. It is difficult to say whether Mao Zedong was afraid of Stalin, but he could not treat the leader of the world proletariat and one of the victorious leaders in the Second World War as an elder brother. This indicates that the Sino-Soviet split started under Stalin. Stalin and Mao both didn't trust each other. Personal meetings were short and dry, and Stalin called Mao red on the outside and white on the inside. In other words, a revisionist. And Mao possibly feared Stalin. A perfect example of Sino-Soviet relations deteriorating under Stalin already is Mao's state visit to Moscow in around late 1949, early 1950. To quote an article, in Shenyang, the largest city in the northeast, Mao disembarked and checked to see if there were posters of him. There were very few, it turned out, and a great many of Stalin, the work of Gao Gang, whom Mao saw as a pro-Soviet dissident. Mao was furious and ordered that the car carrying gifts for Stalin from Gao be uncoupled from the train and the gifts returned to him. Mao's arrival in Moscow on December 16th was an edgy one. He was treated not as the leader of a great revolution, bringing into the communist orbit one of the world's great nations, but rather as the historian Adam Ulam has written, as if he were, say, the head of the Bulgarian party. V.M. Molotov and Nikolai Bulganin, both senior Politburo members, came to the station to meet him. Mao had laid out a handsome Luncheon buffet. He asked the two Soviet leaders to have a drink with him. They refused, based on protocol, Molotov said. They also refused to sit and share the food. Then Mao asked them to accompany him to the residence where he was scheduled to stay. Again, they refused. There was no major celebration or festive party for him. It was as if Mao was now to learn his place in Stalin's constellation, the real communist universe. If he was a fraternal brother, then he should know that there would always be one communist brother who was so much bigger than all the others. One of Khrushchev's aides told his boss that someone named Matsadun was in town. Who? The perplexed Khrushchev asked. You know that German, the aide answered. That was how they saw him, that German, and that was how they treated him. The main reception of the Chinese delegation was held not in the main hall of the Kremlin, but in the Old Metropole Hotel, the usual place for entertaining visiting minor capitalist dignitaries, in Ulam's words. Things did not get better after the first reception. For days on end, Mao was isolated, waiting for Stalin to arrange meetings. No one else could meet with him until Stalin had, and Stalin was taking his time. When Mao first arrived in Moscow, he announced that China looked forward to a partnership with Russia, but he emphasized as well that he wanted to be treated as an equal. Instead, he was being taught a lesson each day. He had become, in Ulam's words, as much captive as guest. As such, he shouted at the walls, convinced that Stalin had bugged the house. I'm here to do more than eat and shit. He hated Russian food. At one point, Kovalyev, his contact man, dropped by to visit him. Mao pointed outside at Moscow and said, "Bad, bad." What did he mean by that? Kovalyev asked. Mao said he was angry at the Kremlin. Kovalyev insisted that he had no right to criticize the boss, and that Kovalyev, would now have to make a report. When Stalin finally met Mao, they provided to have a remarkable mutual instinct for misunderstanding. Why didn't you see Shanghai? Stalin asked, for the Chinese had taken their time before entering the city. Why should we have? Mao answered. If we had captured the city, we would have had to take on the responsibility for feeding the 6 million inhabitants. Stalin, already fearing that Mao favored peasants over workers, was upheld. Here was proof of it. Workers in the city left to suffer. The trip to Moscow wasn't always a disaster, and Mao would have a long memory for the way he had been treated. In economic and military aid, he got very little from his negotiations on the first trip, a paltry $300 million in Soviet arms over 5 years, or $60 million a year. To make matters worse, there were also some Chinese territorial concessions that had to be thrown in. The lack of Russian generosity staggered the Chinese, like taking meat from the mouth of a tiger, Mao would say the years later. For Mao, very much aware of the scale of his great triumph at home and what it meant in terms of history, the treatment by the Soviets had essentially been a humiliation, but one he had been forced to accept without complaint. It is no wonder that Mao conceived, if he had not nurtured it before, an abiding hatred of the Soviet Union. Adam Ulam wrote. Mao was treated horribly in his state visit to Moscow, from Mao being furious over very few Mao posters in Shenyang and Mao throwing a gift to Stalin away, to Mao being treated like trash and Molotov refusing to eat with Mao based on Stalin's orders, to there being no celebration for Mao, and more. Mao's state visit was a humiliating disaster for Mao and a clear sign of deterioration in Sino-Soviet relations under Stalin. Other humiliations in the visit include Stalin showing Mao that he's just his little brother on the international stage, and they treated they treated Mao awfully and with bad names and making him hold meetings in the worst place possible. Mao with anger said that he is dead to do more than eat and shit after he was isolated waiting for hours to finally meet with Stalin and didn't want anymore to be treated like a little brother, but Stalin didn't listen and taught him what his true place is. Mao was very angry and called the Kremlin bad. He hated the Soviet Union for how they treated him, but the Soviets were still telling him that he can't criticize the true superior leader of the global socialist movement. The sad and angry Mao would never forget his bad treatment, especially as a younger brother, which is the groundwork of the Sino-Soviet split. The negotiations led to awful deals, and he was even forced to give up land, which led to his revenge of wanting more land back under Khrushchev and Brezhnev. Mao was humiliated, but since Stalin was the leader of the global socialist movement for decades, he had no choice but to obey Stalin. A fact worth mentioning is that Mao hated Stalin. Mao supported the secret speech in 1956. To quote Mao, during the later part of his life, Stalin took more and more pleasure in this cult of the individual and violated the party's system of democratic centralism and the principle of combining collective leadership with individual responsibility. As a result, he made some serious mistakes. For example, he broadened the scope of the suppression of counter-revolution. He lacked the necessary vigilance on the eve of the anti-fascist war. He failed to pay proper attention to the further development of agriculture and the material welfare of peasantry. He gave certain wrong advice on the international communist movement and in particular made a wrong decision on the question of Yugoslavia. On these issues, Stalin fall victim to subjectivism and one-sidedness and divorced himself from objective reality and from the masses. The cult of the individual is a rotten carryover from the long history of mankind. The cult of the individual is rooted not only in the exploiting classes but also in the small producers. As is well known, patriarchism is a product of small producer economy. The struggle against the cult of the individual, which was launched by the 20th Congress, is a great and courageous fight by the communists and the people of the Soviet Union to clear away the ideological obstacles blocking their advance. Mao also supported the secret speech in private. Let me show you evidence. To quote Mao, when Stalin was criticized by 1956, we were on the one hand happy, but on the other hand apprehensive. It was completely necessary to remove the lid, to break down blind faith, to release the pressure, and to emancipate thought. But we did not agree with demolishing him at one blow. They do not hang up this picture, but we do. Essentially, Mao supported de-Stalinization even in private, but wanted it to be more slow and more gradual. A fact worth mentioning is that de-Stalinization didn't demolish Stalin. Just watch episodes 3, part 1, 2, and the upcoming third part of episode 3 of my Post-Stalin USSR series. I'll put the link to my Post-Stalin USSR series in the description. Also, Mao had harsher criticism of Stalin in private than Khrushchev. To quote Mao. Stalin had a tendency to deviate from Marxism-Leninism. A concrete expression of this is his negation of contradictions, and today the Soviet Union has not yet thoroughly eliminated the influence of this viewpoint of Stalin's. Stalin spoke the language of materialism and the dialectical method, but in reality he was subjectivist. He placed the individual above everything else, negated the group, and negated the masses. He engaged in the worship of the individual. In fact, to be more precise, in personal dictatorships. This is anti-materialism. Stalin also spoke of the dialectical method, but in reality he was metaphysical. For example, in the short history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolshevik, he wrote of the dialectical method but put the fury of contradictions only at the very end. We should say that the most fundamental problem of dialectics is the unity of contradictionary opposites. This is precisely because of his metaphysical character that the one-sided viewpoint was produced, in which the internal connections in a thing was repudiated, and problems are looked at isolated and in a static way. To pay heed to dialectics would be to look at problems and treat the problem as a unity of opposites, and that is why it would be a comprehensive methodology. Life and death, war and peace are opposites of a contradiction. In reality, they also have an internal connection between them. That is why at times these oppositions are also united. When we seek to understand problems, we cannot see only one side. We should analyze it from all sides, look for its essence. In this way, with regard to understanding a person, we will not be taking the position at one time that he is all good and then at another time that he is all bad without a single good point. Why is our party correct? Why is our party correct? It is because we have been able to proceed from the objective conditions in understanding and resolving our problems. In this way, we are more comprehensive and we can avoid being absolutist. From the very beginning, our party has emulated the Soviet Union. The mass line, our political work, and the fear of the dictatorship of the proletariat have all been learned from the October Revolution. At that time, Lenin had focused on the mobilization of the masses and on organizing the worker, peasant, soldier, Soviet, and so on. He did not rely on doing things by administrative decree. Rather, Lenin sent party representatives to carry out political work. The problem lies with the latter phase of Stalin's leadership, which came after the October Revolution. Although Stalin was still promoting socialism and communism, he nonetheless abandoned some of Lenin's things, divided from the orbit of Leninism, and became alienated from the masses, and so on. Therefore, we did suffer from disadvantages when we emulated the things of the later stages of Stalin's leadership and transplanted them for application in China in a doctrinaire way. Today, the Soviet Union still has some advanced experiences that deserve to be emulated, but there are some other aspects in which we simply cannot be like the Soviet Union. For example, the social transformation of the capitalist industries and commerce, the corporatization of agriculture, and the 10 major relationships in economic construction. These are all ways of doing things in China. From now on, in our socialist economic construction, we should primarily start with China's circumstances and with the special characteristics of the circumstances and the time in which we're situated. Therefore, we must still propose the slogan of learning from the Soviet Union, just that we cannot forcibly and cruelly transplant and employ things blindly and in a doctrinaire fashion. Similarly, we can also learn some of the things that are good in bourgeois countries. This is because every country must have its strengths and weaknesses, and we intend chiefly to learn other people's strengths. According to Mao, Stalin deviated from Marxism-Leninism a lot, was metaphysical, did not understand materialism and dialectics, and was bad at dialectical materialism, violated collective leadership, and was a dictator, put the main focus not on class struggle, but on his personality cult, and departed from the masses' interests. Not even Khrushchev had such criticism of Stalin. The only criticism of Stalin that Mao said here that was supported by Khrushchev was believing that Stalin violated collective leadership. Further, Mao also says that China must do its own thing and not copy everything from the USSR, showing further that he wanted to be more independent. What I think is worth mentioning here is that Mao here mentions that the USSR under Khrushchev still upheld a lot of things from the Stalin era that deviated from Marxism-Leninism. More on that later. Let me show you more quotes by Stalin on how Stalin was anti-dialectical and anti-materialist. Stalin had a lot of metaphysical ideas, and he taught many people to engage in metaphysics. In the short course on the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolshevik, he said that Marxist dialectics had four basic characteristics. The first that he talked about was the relationship between things, as if all things were related for no reason. In fact, how are things related? The relationship is actually between the two aspects of a contradiction. In everything, there are two aspects in opposition to each other. The fourth characteristic he talked about was the eternal contradiction in things. Again, he only talked about the struggle between opposites, but not about the unity of opposites. According to this unity of opposites, this basic law of dialectics, opposites struggle against each other, and at the same time they are united. They are mutually exclusive and also interrelated, and under certain conditions they transform themselves into each other. Stalin was a bit inferior. He rejected German philosophy, Kant and Feuerbach, and because Germany was defeated in war, he also rejected German military teachings. Germany's classical philosophy is the forefather of Marxism. Stalin was in reality metaphysical in his ideas, and he did not recognize the unity of opposites. In the dictionary of philosophy, they also employed a metaphysical way of putting things. In it, war does not turn into peace, nor does peace turn into war. The two things are separate and unrelated. They are not mutually transmutable, they only struggle with each other, but there is no unity. Lenin said that war was an extension of politics and a special means, and that peace was a result of war. He said that politics was struggle during the time of peace, and that it is during times of war that peace is fomented. Stalin misled many people. These people had a lot of metaphysics in their minds and became rigid in their thinking. Thus, they committed political mistakes. When others disagreed with them occasionally, they were ostracized. When one was deemed a counter-revolutionary, the only fate one could meet was that of death by execution, and whoever disagreed with the Soviet Union was called anti-Soviet. But in real life, Stalin could not do all things in this way. Stalin didn't execute or jail everybody. In 1936 and 1937, he killed many people. In 1938, he killed fewer. And in 1939, he killed even fewer. It is not possible to execute everyone who disagrees. We, for one, had disagreements with Stalin. We wanted to sign a Sino-Soviet treaty, but he didn't want to sign. We wanted the Chinese Changchun railway back, but he didn't want to give it up. Even so, it is still possible to snatch up the meat out of a tiger's mouth. I mean, this is very harsh criticism of Stalin. Mao literally called him a bit inferior. He also says that those that disagreed with Stalin's metaphysics were killed and deemed as counter-revolutionaries, so Mao would have been as well. He also said that Stalin tried to kill everyone who disagreed with him. Mao is also complaining about Stalin not doing territorial concessions to China. What I think is worth noting is that Khrushchev defended Stalin from Mao's criticisms of Stalin, like Mao calling Stalin metaphysical, anti-materialist, putting the main focus on his personality cult and not on class struggle, his critiques of Stalin's economic problems of the USSR, and emphasizing material incentives over moral ones, and so on. What I believe is worth mentioning the most is that Khrushchev defended Stalin from Mao's attack on Stalin, that class struggle wasn't abolished in the USSR, to quote Mao. In 1936, Stalin talked about the elimination of class struggle, but in 1939 he carried out another purge of counter-revolutionaries. Wasn't that class struggle too? Khrushchev and Brezhnev strongly defended Stalin from his attack by Mao, believing that the USSR had abolished class struggle in 1936 is essentially what State of the Whole People is. Watch episode 1 of my Post-Stalin USSR series. But I believe that Mao was a rat for using a lot of his attacks that he used against Stalin, for which he called Stalin a deviationist, to later call Khrushchev and Brezhnev revisionists. A perfect example of this is State of the Whole People. Ideology did not play a role at all in the Sino-Soviet split. Mao was an opportunist. He used the secret speech and a lot of Stalin's own ideas and actions to call post-Stalin USSR revisionist as an ideological justification for the Sino-Soviet split, and so he could become the sole and only leader of the global socialist movement. Mao also agreed with peaceful coexistence. There was no difference between Stalin's and Khrushchev's peaceful coexistence. Watch episode 2 of my Post-Stalin USSR series. Though I also believe that Mao was angered by Khrushchev's obsession with peaceful coexistence as well. In the late Stalin era, avoiding nuclear war became part of peaceful coexistence, so Khrushchev upheld this principle, and this led to him backing down in the second Taiwan Strait crisis to not cause nuclear war, which angered Mao. Also, a lot of people cite a pamphlet by Mao from 1963 as proof that he changed his mind on the secret speech later. If you read it, you can see straight through Mao's lies and bullshit, to quote Mao in the pamphlet. But since some of the wrong ideas put forward by Stalin were accepted and applied by certain Chinese comrades, we Chinese should bear the responsibility in its struggle against left and right opportunism. Therefore, our party criticized only its own erring comrades and never put the blame on Stalin. Well, anyway, now I'd like to mention that Mao supported crushing Molotov's coup against Khrushchev in 1957. Many Maoists say that Khrushchev reintroduced capitalism in 1956. If you ask them, though, what economic reform restored the capitalism in 1956, what it's called, they won't be able to tell you. So that's funny. I endorse the CPSU Central Committee solution on the Molotov question. That was a struggle of opposites. The facts proved that unity could not be achieved and that the two sides were mutually exclusive. The Molotov clique took the opportunity to attack at a time when Comrade Khrushchev was abroad and unprepared. However, even though they waged a surprise attack, our comrade Khrushchev is no fool. He is a smart person who immediately mobilized his troops and waged a victorious counterattack. That struggle was won between two lines, one erroneous and one relatively correct. In the 4 or 5 years since Stalin's death, the situation has improved considerably in the Soviet Union in the sphere of both domestic policy and foreign policy. This indicates that the line represented by Comrade Khrushchev is correct and that opposition to his line is incorrect. Mao Zedong, source Mao and the Sino-Soviet Partnership, 1945 to 1959, A New History, page 255. What's even funnier is that he said that Khrushchev's line was correct, whereas Molotov's was incorrect. Mao even goes as far as saying that the USSR improved considerably and got better in economic and domestic and foreign policy from 1953 to 1957. This quote is from 1957. You can see that by Mao saying that the USSR improved in the 4 or 5 years since Stalin's death. According to Mao, capitalism was restored in 1956. I guess that's good according to Mao, since he praised Khrushchev's domestic and economic policy in 1957. Khrushchev, of course, didn't restore Khrushchev, of course, did not restore capitalism, but the irony is still so good. What I believe is also worth noting is that Mao praises the Sovnarkhozy here, since they started in 1957. According to Mao, state of the whole people and peaceful coexistence were also proclaimed in the 20th Congress of the CPCU, but he said that Khrushchev had good domestic and foreign policy and the correct line in 1957. Despite that, I just love the irony. Now, I'd also like to compare Mao's and Hoxha's arguments against post-Stalin USSR to Trotsky's on Stalin, since they are very similar. Mao and Hoxha said that the USSR under Khrushchev and Brezhnev was a capital state. Trotsky said that it's not state capitalist nor socialist under Stalin. Instead, it's building socialism and is in the transitional period from capitalism to socialism. Mao and Hoxha called the USSR under Khrushchev and Brezhnev a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Trotsky called the USSR under Stalin a degenerated worker state. Mao and Hoxha called the USSR under both Khrushchev and Brezhnev a fascist state. Trotsky called Stalin a fascist collaborator. If you read Mao and Hoxha on post-Stalin USSR, you may as well start reading Trotsky on Stalin. As you can see, though, Trotsky's attacks on Stalin were way smarter and way less ridiculous than the ones of Mao and Hoxha on post-Stalin USSR. At least he didn't downright call the USSR fascist. Trotsky was a smart man. I don't support him, but he was definitely smart and the greatest Marxist enemy that the USSR has ever faced, unlike the two clowns Mao and Hoxha. There is a lot of similarity between Mao, Hoxha, and Trotsky as well, as you can see. And yes, Mao and Hoxha did both call post-Stalin USSR under Khrushchev and Brezhnev fascist, to quote Mao. The Soviet Union today is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, a dictatorship of the grand bourgeoisie, a fascist German dictatorship, and a Hitlerite dictatorship. They are a bunch of rascals worse than the Gaule. This is under Khrushchev, as this work is from May 1964. He also called the USSR fascist under Brezhnev, as you can see in the documentary from before after the 1969 Sino-Soviet border skirmishes.
The Russians are again denounced by Mao Zedong and Lin Piao, his heir apparent. The Soviet troops, they say, are revisionist fascist bandits.
Also, there is this pamphlet published by the CPC in 1970 called Social Imperialism or Leninism. And remember, the CPC couldn't publish anything without state approval, without the approval of Mao. So Mao basically believed in this. Basically, they called Brezhnev a fascist here. To quote this is exactly what the renegade Brezhnev and his ilk are doing to the great Lenin. In their so-called theses on the centenary of the birth of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, they have the impudence to distort the great image of Lenin, the revolutionary teacher of the proletariat, and pass off their revisionist rubbish as Leninism. They pretend to commemorate Lenin, but in reality, they are appropriating the name of Lenin to press forward with their social imperialism, social fascism, and social militarism. What an outrageous insult to Lenin. Now, this is funny because when Brezhnev came to power, the CPC published a pamphlet which called the CPSU and the Soviet people great, Marxist, Leninist, and revolutionary, which is funny considering that Mao called the USSR a fascist Hitlerite dictatorship 6 months before this pamphlet, and fascist again from 1969 onwards. To quote that CPC pamphlet, history will develop in accordance with the laws discovered by Marxism-Leninism. It will march forward along the road of the October Revolution. Beyond all doubt, the great Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the great Soviet people, with their revolutionary traditions, are fully capable of making new contributions in safeguarding the great socialist achievements, the lofty prestige of the first socialist power funded by Lenin, the purity of Marxism-Leninism, and the victorious advance of the revolutionary cause of the proletariat. Keep in mind that the Lieberman-Kosygin reforms were happening in November 1964 already on a small scale. Well, anyway, Mao later changed his mind on Brezhnev after Brezhnev didn't allow Mao to be called the sole and only leader of the global socialist movement, so yeah. Now, one last fact worth mentioning is that the Soviet Union was always open to restore relations with China. Under Khrushchev, they had a meeting in 1962 to improve relations, as we saw in the documentary from before, and Brezhnev continued that. To quote Brezhnev, "Our party and the Soviet people sincerely desire friendship with People's China and its Communist Party." Leonid Brezhnev, the 23rd Congress of the CPSU. Okay, kids, so I think that this is enough for today. I made enough hot takes for today, and I literally have no more space left. I record on tablet, so yeah, I abused my storage harder than Maoists abused the term revisionist. Now you know why the Sino-Soviet split has happened. I will probably make a conclusion to this part in the next part, because I quite literally have no storage left. I didn't know that this would be so long. In part 2 of episode 7, we will talk about the Soviet-Albanian split and the Soviet DPRK split. We will talk about Hoxha and how he called the USSR under Khrushchev and Brezhnev fascist, and how he supported the secret speech in public and more. At the end, I will also mention everything that I forgot to mention throughout this entire series. Well, anyway, I made enough hot takes for today. Link to my Post-Stalin USSR series is in the description. My sources will be in the pinned comment of the comment section as always. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed. Stalin ate all of my 2 trillion tons of grain that I had in 2 seconds. I will probably starve to death now. Bye.